we have some really interesting comparisons to do now. We're going to do some organoleptics. So the last thing we made was this fresh herb extraction with the STX infusium, right? So that's what we have right here. We have the mark from pressing it out. It's dry, fibrous, wonderful. I should try that later. And we have our notes for that right here. And over here we have the fresh ginger made in the Vitamix, right? And same concentration, same everything, except two different methods. The mark for that. And then here we have our fresh ginger in the jar, classical maceration, which is still doing its thing. So that's why we haven't strained it out yet. And then over here, just for color interest, we have the two dried ginger classical macerations that we started earlier. This is pretty interesting too. Remember, we were decanting this one because there was a lot of white stuff in the bottom. And you can see with this one, there's also some of that white stuff in the bottom. We haven't finished decanting this one yet because we just made it, right? But with this one, we gently poured off the clear product, and then the rest of it we poured through this coffee filter. Yeah, and it's pretty interesting if you look at it because it didn't take all of that white stuff out. There's still a little bit. And inside the coffee filter, there's dried, caked up white stuff, which we decided was probably cellulose, plant cell wall materials, etc. So we didn't get that much more. You know?
Maybe a few milliliters. What is that?
It looks like maybe 25 mils altogether. And it looks lighter because it's still got some white stuff in it, and there's less in the beaker, so it makes it look a bit lighter. But what we'll do when we're all finished is pour this into there and then call that our finished tincture and put it into the bottle that we prepared for it. Okay, so that's what this is. And here, since this isn't finished yet, we're not going to taste this, but we're going to do an organoleptic comparison with these two. And before we do that, the other thing we did was we measured the volume of the final tincture, which turned out to be 250 mils. If we had added together all of the menstruum we used, which was 240 mils, because we started with 120 grams, 1 to 2, makes 240 mils. And we calculated that there were 89 milliliters of water in that much ginger. Hypothetically, we could have, if we got every last atom, every last atom of moisture out of that, we could have gotten 329 mils. But that's not how it works. You can't get it all back out again.
I tried. I was
and this was with the mighty press, right? So what we actually got was 250 mils, which is 104% of the amount of menstruum that we put in. This ginger, interestingly, retained quite a bit of water. Yeah. Isn't that wild?
That is. Yeah. But it makes sense. It's organic material and
it's fibrous. It's super fibrous, which probably has something to do with it. This feels a little damp in certain places, like it wasn't possible to squeeze up. Can you feel that dampness? Yeah. And this is an example of what we were talking about. Different herbal material will retain different amounts. And that's just characteristic of the herb. So you can't say, it's going to be the same for every herb. That's why we're always measuring before and after and doing all these calculations and stuff. But that's interesting to think about because all that water didn't come out, which means our menstruum is going to be a bit higher ethanol percent than we designed it for. With ginger, that's interesting because you could also calculate that out. It takes time. What is the menstruum actually? That would be an interesting number to have. You can kind of put ginger in the category of the end product is going to be higher in ethanol than we calculated for because all that water didn't actually come out. The trick there is you don't know how much of the moisture that's retained is ethanol and how much is water. Yes, that's kind of like one of those impossible to know things. So there you go. That's what happened. Let's compare. Okay. I'll get to you so that I don't mix them together. But so let's start with the fresh Vitamix that we decanted. That is so interesting. Doesn't that look alchemical?
Yes, it does.
Yeah. Okay. And I think we actually tasted this earlier. Remember, we were going on about how delicious and aromatic it was and not super hot. It'll be really interesting to compare it to the STX version that was extracted with a little bit of heat.
Just a little bit.
Ooh! There it is again. Oh,
Wow.
Yeah. I feel that rushing to my face again.
Yes.
It's not super burning hot. Like we compared it to something earlier, a dried version, and it was a lot hotter. Remember that?
Yeah. You said amazing represents fresh ginger super well.
Mm-hmm.
Buzzing warm, but not too hot.
Buzzing warm.
60% nice. Very diffusive, distinct, diaphoretic in my face.
The warmth
you felt that again
right now. Yeah, do you feel it?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I'm like,
I know.
a little overheated here. Yeah. Soothing and warm on stomach, delicious aromatics.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's compare it to the same tincture. Okay, basically 60%, 1 to 2, right?
Okay.
But we did it in the STX infusion, which means we used a little bit of heat over that amount of time.
Yeah.
Okay. What's this going to be like? Ooh. Oh, that's interesting.
That's hot.
It's hotter.
Yeah.
Which makes sense since we put heat into it. Ooh. And it tastes a little different.
It does. I think I personally like maybe this Vitamix better.
It's a little sharper.
It is more sharp.
It's a little sharper.
Still medicinal in that it has that warm feel on the tongue, and I think it was just more sharp. That was the difference.
And I think it's a little more slippery. Do you feel that? It's like I feel like my tongue is a little more coated with this one.
No, I can see that.
And the heat is more persistent, and it's kind of driving deeper.
Yes. Feels good on my stomach.
This is closer to dried, which is interesting. And the other thing that makes me say this is closer to dried is the color. Look at that color difference.
I was going to say, even the color.
Right? Mm-hmm. It's definitely darker. We haven't decanted it yet, but it's definitely darker. And my guess is some of those ginger oils have converted to sugar oils, even though it wasn't dried, just because of the amount of heat we applied.
Yes.
Right? So that
makes sense.
Yeah. I'm dripping it on myself. It's closer in character to a dry ginger extraction. Mm-hmm. But when we look at it, this is so cool. Let's compare it to this actual dried ginger classical maceration. Look at that color. So it's not quite there. Mm-hmm. It's not quite the same. It's not as dark amber, but it's definitely intermediate between the fresh Vitamix and the dried maceration.
I see that, yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Wow.
Ooh. Ooh.
I like them both, actually.
I do too. You know what? I'm thinking again, this is softer, this is harder. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So if you were formulating for different purposes, I think maybe this one would soften your other ingredients, act a little more like a coragen. Mm-hmm. This one is almost like rooty, woody in a way.
Yeah,
more
I can
like
see that too.
Dried one.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this one is more like aromatic, flowery.
Yes.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. Awesome.
So it's like pick your character. Great, subtle differences, right? But great example of how different extraction methods bring out different characters from the same herb. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Wow. We did try this one first, so we kind of pre-warmed ourselves. Mm-hmm. What would be really interesting is to try this one not after we tried this one. Right. Give it half an hour or something and try it again. Because when you try things really close to each other, they can kind of confound each other a little bit. That's true. Super interesting.
Okay.
Yeah. And so with this one, our yield was 104%. It also retained quite a lot of the water, which leads me to think ginger retained quite a lot of the menstruum, I should say. Both of them retain quite a lot of the menstruum.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of reinforces our idea that fibrous ginger holds on to its liquid
Yes,
more than some other herbs might. Yeah, so that's cool. And then again, this is our classical fresh maceration where we mince the ginger right on the cutting board with a knife, and it's still distinctly it's more golden and less amber.
Absolutely.
That.
Yeah, and I've been shaking that every day.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
all of them.
Yeah. So even compared to the fresh Vitamix, you can see, and that's not if we take the dried one out. Yeah. If you compare this to the fresh, that one you have in your hand there, this is the STX. These two, right? You can see that the Vitamix one is definitely a little darker, even though we don't have it strained out, which makes sense because with this one, we used a high amount of agitation. So it was a more efficient extraction. Yes. So we got more of that fresh golden gingerols and all that stuff out, right? And it'll be really interesting once this is done, because we started this, let's see, about 8 days ago.
Yes.
Right? And we're going to let it go for 6 weeks, I think is what we decided on this one. So at the end of 6 weeks, we will strain this out, press it out, and then it'll be really interesting to compare the colors to see if they got closer to each other. Yeah. And then we can taste this one and this one next. Wow. Excellent. So much ginger.
It's good. Yay. I appreciate it.
Yeah, me too. It's amazing. That was great. More experiments that we could do, but we're not going to because time. But we could do STX infusium extraction of dried ginger and a Vitamix extraction of dried ginger and see how close those are to each other.
That sounds great.
Right?
Yeah.
Because I predict drying and heating bring things closer together. A dried Vitamix versus STX they're not going to be that different from each other.
Yeah, we'll see.
Maybe a little. Yeah. So that's what we'll be doing in the future. Okay, did we try everything?
I believe so. Everything that we can now.
There we go. All right. So we're getting ready for our next adventure and our next class, which is the Southwest School of Botanical Medicine, Michael Moore style percolation. So we're moving out of our classic macerations and our power macerations and into percolation.